While I think it is necessary to be honest about racism of our past and present, it is also necessary to empower children and adults with a vision that change is possible. This is one of the many excellent examples Dr. Beverly Tatum offers on conducting effective racial dialogue in her book, Where Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race. Good evening. My name is Vivian Oden, and I am Vice President for Special Projects at the Hampton Roads Community Foundation. And I'm honored to welcome you to a conversation about race with Dr. Beverly Tatum. In addition to your being in the room tonight, we are live streaming on Facebook. The video will be available to watch on our website after tonight's event. At the conclusion of tonight's program, Dr. Tatum will sign books in the lobby, and our local bookseller, Prince Books, will have for sale copies of her 20th anniversary edition of her book. Tonight's forum is the Hampton Roads Community Foundation's inaugural event in partnership with Virginia Humanities called Beneath the Surface, Race and the History of Race in South Hampton Roads. The Hampton Roads Community Foundation is Southeastern Virginia's largest grant and scholarship provider. Thanks to generous donors from all walks of life, the Community Foundation has awarded more than $282 million in grants and scholarships since 1950 to make life better in Hampton Roads. In the lobby, there was a table with more information about the Community Foundation and Virginia Humanities. We thank Virginia Humanities for this partnership and the value they give to racial equity. We have several members of school board, city council, mayors, and vice mayors throughout the region in attendance. You play a critical role in this work, and we look forward to engaging you in the future. Thank you for being here tonight. Also, we have board members from the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and Virginia Humanities in attendance. Thank you all for being here as well. When you arrived, you received a note card. Please write your questions for Dr. Tatum on your card and raise your hand for a person with a basket to collect your question. Please feel free to write your name on the card. At this time, I'd like to introduce the President and CEO of the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, Dr. Beverly, to tell you more about this initiative.
Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And welcome to my home city, Chesapeake. Any more from Chesapeake? Our elected officials would be upset with me from Chesapeake if I didn't say, and for those of you who are not from Chesapeake, before you leave, be sure to spend a little money. Well, let me add my personal welcome to each of you to what we consider to be the official launch of the Hampton Roads Community Foundation's project with Virginia Humanities, Beneath the Surface, Race and the History of Race in Hampton Roads. This project is a part of our larger commitment to helping the region become a more inclusive and equitable community. So why are we here? More specifically, why did 1,147 people from across this region sign up to participate in this event? And why did the foundation include providing leadership in understanding, promoting, and addressing racial, ethnic, and gender inclusion and fairness in its recently adopted strategic roadmap? And why have we chosen to focus initially on race? My guess is that the answer to all four questions is one and the same. Because race really does matter, and attention must be paid, now more than ever, for reasons all too obvious. Because the nation's founding fathers, as flawed as they were, introduced the idea of a new world bigger than they were, and far grander in its sense of freedom and democracy than they could have ever envisioned. Because In the muck of it all, race has long held a defining place in American society. And racial inequity is the consequence of a long history of racial bias that has limited the opportunities for people of color. Because racial inequity is embedded in our culture, our laws and policies, educational institutions, and economy. And attention must be paid, for it threatens the future that all of us share as a region, a commonwealth, a nation. To be sure, the resultant system is bigger than any one of us, but attention must be paid. For the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, racial inequity is a powerful force pushing against a thriving community with opportunity for all. What we envision for the people of Hampton Roads, in education, in healthcare, in the economy, its workforce. This evening's public conversation on race and education is an important beginning. We couldn't be more pleased and honored to have with us President Emerita Beverly Tatum of Spelman College for the conversation. As importantly, you should know that the foundation is simultaneously engaged in other related work. For example, we're conducting our own internal equity assessment for the simple reason that we can't aspire to help lead externally if we haven't first looked internally. The bottom line is this: the Hampton Roads Community Foundation recognizes the complexity of the journey that lies ahead, and we're all in for the long haul. We pray that each of you is as well. Why? Because attention must be paid, and so much depends upon our together getting it right. Thanks for coming.
Good evening again. Let's give it up again for Deputy Croce for those words. Hello, and my name is Matthew Gibson. I'm the Executive Director of Virginia Humanities. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight for a conversation about race with Dr. Beverly D. Tatum. I want to also thank April Woodard and Dr. Tatum for being here with us for this very special evening. And I'd like to recognize the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, without whom this event would not be possible. So what is Virginia Humanities? What are the humanities? Virginia Humanities is Virginia's state's humanities council. Along with 55 other state and territorial councils, we were created by federal legislation in the early 1970s and are supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. As one of the largest and most diversely programmed humanities councils, Virginia Humanities is funded by the Virginia General Assembly and generous partners such as the Hampton Roads Community Foundation. In addition, many of you invest and participate in our work, and I want to thank you now for your support and your participation. For 45 years, we have worked to explore and share Virginia's histories and cultures through our public and digital programs, such as Encyclopedia Virginia, our radio shows, such as With Good Reason and Backstory, grant making, our support of teachers, researchers, writers, filmmakers, and traditional artists. At our core, we believe in the power of history and culture, the written and spoken word, and their ability to help foster empathy and deepen mutual understanding of one another. If you've recently seen Monticello's powerful new exhibits on African American life, or learned through HBO documentaries about Mildred and Richard Loving's fight to legalize interracial marriage, or read Margaret Lee Shetterly's book, or seen the movie, Hidden Figures, then you know some of the stories that we've had an early role in helping to tell. But we don't just support humanities work that results in blockbuster film. It's actually pretty rare that we get to do that. The narratives and the work that we support are those that might have a quieter impact. but no less importance to our individual lives, our homes, our neighborhoods, our towns and cities, and in the case of Hampton Roads, a region of communities that are both connected but also distinct. In his 1962 essay, The Creative Process, James Baldwin writes that society must know and accept that our visible reality hides a deeper one, and that all our action and achievement rest on things unseen. And in his 1965 Ebony article, The White Man's Guilt, he explains, quote, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations," end quote. You may have seen this before if you've ever been to the Smithsonian Museum for African American History and Culture. As you leave, going up the last ramp, you look up on the wall, there's an excerpt of this quote on that wall. But tonight with the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and all of you, we are both humbled and excited to launch the Beneath the Surface initiative. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, the Director of African American Programs at Virginia Humanities, Justin Reed.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I have a very easy job. I get to introduce our moderator and our guest speaker. So that's what I'm going to do. First, I'll start with our moderator, April Woodard. She is an Emmy-nominated co-host of Coast Live, a daily lifestyle show on WTKR in Eastern Virginia. She also serves as an assistant professor at the Scripps Howard School of Journalism at Hampton University. She was a correspondent on the nationally syndicated news magazine Inside Edition for 15 years. On BET and BET International Networks, she hosted the shows Mad Swag, Music Around the Globe, and covered the Oscars, NAACP Image Awards, the BET Awards, BET Honors, and Black Girls Rock, among others. April created and hosts the web entertainment site show The Media Brew, and has contributed as an expert on HLN and CNN. Beyond the camera, April Woodard is a gifted writer who has penned a children's book and writes articles for various magazines, websites, and on her social media platform, #April's A-List. April is a Hampton Roads native and a graduate of the University of Virginia. Give her. I gave you a second there. I was trying to. All right. So, Dr. Beverly Tatum. As you know, she is the president emeritus of Spelman College. She's also a clinical psychologist known for both her expertise on race relations and as a thought leader in higher education. Her 13 years as the president of Spelman College from 2002 to 2015 were marked by innovation and growth, and her visionary leadership was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. The author of several books, including the best-selling Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, now in a new 2017 20th anniversary edition, and Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in the Era of School Resegregation. Tatum is a sought-after speaker on the topics of racial identity development, race and education, strategies for creating inclusive campus environments, and higher education leadership. In 2005, Dr. Tatum was awarded the prestigious Brock and National Prize in Education for innovative leadership in the field. A fellow of the American Psychological Association, she was the 2014 recipient of the APA Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology, the organization's highest honor. She holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and an MA and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, as well as an MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Don't be shy. How are you? I'm well, delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming. Yes, I'm so excited to be here. I want to welcome everybody who's here at the Chesapeake Conference Center, but I also want to welcome everyone who is here on Facebook, who is actually streaming us live now. I want to thank the Hampton Roads Community Foundation, who since 1950 have inspired philanthropy and has been transforming the quality of life in southeastern Virginia. So we do have a hashtag, so if you are a social media person and you want to quote us or quote Dr. Tatum, the hashtag is #BeneathTheSurface. And Dr. Tatum is at BDT Spellman, that's her or her, social media, and I'm at April Woodard. So, with that, can we talk about race?
Well, let's get started.
Let's get started. Okay. So, Dr. Tatum, I want to talk to you. 20 years now since your award-winning book was published, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? So, the question is, where do you think we are in terms of progress 20 years later?
That's a great question, and let me just say that when I took up the task of updating my 1997 book for a 2017 release, I was somewhat depressed. I'm just going to say that. Because when I reflected on what had happened in the last 20 years, most of it was not particularly good news. And just last year, I read Dr. King's 1968 book, which is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And in that book, it was his last book before his assassination, he talks about the fact that after every period of social progress, there's a period, or what he calls a counter-revolution, pushback against that progress. And if we're honest about the last 20 years, I think we can say there's more pushback than there actually has been forward motion. And you might say, well, why do I say that? If you look at, for example, school desegregation was something that was underway in the 70s and 80s, but in the time since then, there's been really a lot of backward motion. So our schools today are almost, and in some places, as segregated as they were at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, as one example. We can talk about the legislation of the 60s, the civil rights legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has really been gutted by a Supreme Court decision of 2013, and we have seen just a rash of what I'm going to call voter suppression laws, voter ID laws, and other things making it more difficult for people to vote since the 2008 election of President Barack Obama. And we can point to those, that voter suppression as a step backward. We can look at mass incarceration, and the spike in the incarceration of Black and brown people really took off in the 90s, and over the last 20 years has really escalated. So there are a lot of things that have sort of moved us backward. But I want to say, hope is not lost, in the sense that after every period of progress, there is pushback, but then there's progress again. So I like to think about the possibility of forward motion. I think we're at a moment in our national history when we have a choice. Dr. King said chaos or community. I think we once again have that choice. Chaos or community, forward motion or continued backward trend. But right at this moment, I think it's a choice moment. It's a moment of choosing.
You speak about voter suppression,
Yes.
and you live in the Georgia area.
Sure do.
In Atlanta. And I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about gerrymandering, ID laws, all of those a little bit more specifically on why we are moving backwards.
Well, let me just say I had an up-close and personal experience with this. I'm sure this audience knows that Stacey Abrams ran for governor in Georgia and came very close to winning. And Stacey is a Spelman alum. Very proud of her. But my husband and I volunteered for voter protection. You know, we did the training and we were on the phone, and you know, as a person with more spare time than I used to have, I volunteered, and it was really striking to me the calls we got, not just on election day, but leading up, because there's early voting in Georgia, People would call to find out were they eligible to vote, where should they be voting. But on election day, it was just shocking, the things that were happening. Hundreds of people lined up to vote in Metro Atlanta, which is where I live, and to find that some polling places were just telling people to leave because they'd run out of the forms you're supposed to fill out when you enter. As just one example. There was one place where there were, people couldn't vote because the machines were there, but the cords were not. I mean, you have to wonder about whether this is just incompetence or malfeasance. You don't need me to tell you, perhaps if you've been paying attention, the then candidate for governor was also the person supervising elections. So it was just outrageous. There were just many examples. Here's another example. In rural parts of Georgia, where maybe there's just one polling place because it's a sparsely populated area, there were places where they were trying to close those polling places. So there was like no polling place and a convenient distance for many people to vote. Fortunately, in that case, there was a legal challenge and a judge ordered the plan to be disbanded. But just, why do we want to try to make it harder for people to vote? In a democracy, we should be trying to make it easier for people to vote. And I just saw a lot of examples in my own state, but we know that it wasn't just in my own state. North Carolina, lots of states actually. And increasingly the focus on creating, it seems like a simple thing to say, okay, well, bring your ID, but if it has to be a special ID,
Right.
and if the place where you get the special ID is not available, there are lots of communities where it's not accessible by public transportation to go to get that special ID, for example. Students have IDs, unless it's a state-issued ID, you can't use your student ID. So there are lots of loopholes in what would seem to be, most people would say, well, of course, show an ID so you can prevent voter fraud, but if you make it hard for people to get those IDs, and they have to be particular kinds of IDs, that is, in my mind, a barrier that you're setting up to prevent people from voting. And if you have to pay for the ID, then it becomes a kind of poll tax.
Absolutely. Some people have made a correlation between the numbers of people who came out and poured out during the Obama campaign to the voter suppression, because there were record numbers of people who came out.
Absolutely.
Particularly people of color.
Absolutely.
Do you think there's a direct correlation between that and the suppression of?
Well, it's one of the things that in the opening section of my book, in the prologue, I talk about some of the events of the last 20 years, and certainly the rise of voter suppression is one of them, not only in terms of the Supreme Court decision in 2013, and for people who are wondering, well, what was that decision? Let me just take a minute to educate folks. There was at the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the provision that if a state had a history of trying to prevent people from voting, a lot of those states, not all of them, but many of them southern states, if there was a history of trying to keep people from voting, denying access to the ballot, then any state with that kind of history had to get judicial permission before they made any changes in their laws related to voting. The Supreme Court decision of 2013 basically said, states now are behaving themselves, in essence, and so it's unfair, it's an undue burden to states to say that they have to seek permission before they make any changes. They should be able to make the changes they want to make because, we're living in a different time.
Wow.
And then if there's a problem, people can seek relief through the courts, but that's a long and drawn-out process. So once the court ruled that you didn't have to get permission in advance, it in essence gave states permission to do whatever they wanted, and there's been a rash of states, particularly Republican-controlled states, but perhaps not only, but particularly in Republican-controlled states, there's been a rash of laws instituted that make it harder. And there have been court cases challenging them, but the process of challenging is a slow process, and meanwhile elections are happening.
Right.
And so, but certainly the evidence suggests, if we just look at the data, the evidence suggests that the election of 2008, which we know was won by President Barack Obama, was won largely because of a coalition of progressive white voters and a high turnout of voters of color. If you can keep some portion of that coalition from voting, it becomes harder to win elections. And so that it's not a surprise that we've seen a lot of those laws instituted since the 2013 election. Certainly that happened in 2014, but certainly they were in force and impacting the 2016 election and in Georgia, the most recent gubernatorial election.
All right, so you talked about voter suppression. Also, I wanted to talk about voting, but in a different perspective. The National Urban League is meeting now, and they released their State of America report. And it found that Russians interfered in the U.S. elections, but also particularly targeted African Americans to create conflict with Black Americans. So what is your reaction to this report that is showing that they specifically targeted our communities to create disenfranchisement, to create the feeling of, well, there's no need for me to vote, etc.?
Well, certainly there was a lot of disinformation around candidates and voting, as you just pointed out, targeting African Americans. But there was another study along the same lines, an analysis done, I believe it was by the Washington Post, that looked at the fake accounts, those fake Twitter accounts that were set up by Russian operatives, and looking at the posts that they made. And many of those posts, not only targeting African Americans, but pushing on the racial divides that already exist. The United States has a Achilles heel, we might call it, of racial conflict, a history of racial conflict, and a history of not being able to talk productively about race, which is one of the reasons why this conversation is so important, because it's breaking that silence. But if a foreign entity knows that get U.S. voters thinking and talking about race in conflictual ways, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, that kind of thing, will drive a wedge that makes it very difficult for people to come together toward common goals. That's a vulnerability that we have as a nation, something we should be working on.
Do you think it worked?
Oh, clearly it worked.
I'm going to ask, as a reporter and a person who reports the news, sometimes, you hear psychologists say, okay, it's Thanksgiving, it's Christmas, don't talk about politics, don't talk about race. So you have all of these stories that we're putting out there, don't do it because it's going to break up the family, it's going to break up the community. Why do you think it's so hard for us to have mature conversations without storming out or no longer talking to your sister-in-law or, no longer talking to somebody in the community when you walk down the street to see them?
Well, I'd like to conduct a little experiment.
Okay.
Right here. And I want to ask our audience, unfortunately our Facebook audience won't be able to participate directly, but they can be thinking about their own answers to this question. But I'd like everyone in the audience here in this space to take a moment and think about your earliest race-related memory. Now raise your hand if you've thought of something. No, and I'm not going to call on you. There's no risk, right? Okay, so many hands are up, and now here's the question I want to ask, and you'll see where I'm going shortly. How old were you at the time of the thing you remembered? So you could hold up fingers if you just a visual like 5 or how old, or call out ages.
6, 8,
Okay. I'm looking at the fingers, I'm hearing the sounds. I'm seeing a lot of 5s, 6s, 8s, 10. You must have at 2. Somebody's got 2 up there. So I don't think you can get much younger than 2. There's a 2 over there. I don't think you can get much younger than 2. I saw somebody with 10 up, and of course if you're older than 10, you didn't have enough fingers. But a lot of you had 5s, 6s, 7s. I've heard those ages as well. If you think about that 5, 6, 7-year-old age as kind of early elementary school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, raise your hand just so we get to a sense of how many of you are in this category. Raise your hand if your memory is an early elementary school, you know, in that early 5, 6, 7, a lot of you, okay. Probably if we had a, you know, if we were really scientific and charted it, we would see a big spike at that end of the continuum. And so now I'd like to hear words. What words are associated with your memory? Like, by words I don't mean what someone said, I mean feelings. What feeling words are associated with the thing you recalled? I heard someone say hurt, isolation. I heard somebody say fear, sadness, confusion, anger, humiliation, embarrassment. That covers a lot of people. I'm sure there's some other words that we might hear, but if we think about confusion, embarrassment, humiliation, fear, anger, sadness, these are words that we would think of as uncomfortable, right? People don't seek to be confused. They don't seek to be angry. They don't seek to be sad or humiliated, certainly embarrassed, etc. So they're uncomfortable feelings. So now I want to know, and you can do this with a show of hands, whether at the time that this incident occurred, you had a conversation with a concerned adult, a parent or a teacher, at the time that it happened. Raise your hand if you did. Okay, we have some hands up. Raise your hand if you did not. I think it's pretty easy to see there are many more did nots than dids. So how many of you have some personal experience with 5, 6, or 7-year-olds? I bet a lot of you do. Your own children, grandchildren, friends, babysitting. You know, you've gotten to know some little kids sometime in your life. And see if you agree with me. 5, 6, and 7-year-olds are pretty chatty. They don't filter much, right? You know, they just blurt stuff out. So we've got an audience full, you know, hundreds of people in this room. Many of you had an early memory, an early experience that was uncomfortable in some way at an age when you chat a lot and yet you didn't tell anyone. This is counterintuitive, right? It's not the behavior we typically associate with 5, 6, and 7-year-olds who tell you everything. They blurt stuff out all the time. And I ask these questions everywhere I go, and I get the same answers. And I wanted to demonstrate this here because what I want to point out is that many of us have a long history of not talking about race. That history goes back to being 5, 6, or 7, and learning somewhere from somebody that you're not supposed to talk about it. That it makes other people uncomfortable if you do, and that it will somehow disrupt the status quo in ways that others around you won't like. And so we stay silent. Many people stay silent. Now, it's not true for everybody. Some people raised their hands and said, yes, I did have that conversation. So it's not a universal experience, but there are lots of people who, like all of you here, have had not just one, but an early experience that has been repeated over time throughout your life that lets you know this is not something you're supposed to talk about. So it's not a surprise that you get a knot in your stomach, right? When someone says, we're going to have a conversation about this uncomfortable thing that you've learned from early childhood not to discuss.
Right. Interesting, you got me thinking now. So my situation was going to second grade, and the bus driver telling the kids on the bus if they didn't behave, they would have to sit with the black girl. Anybody who knows my mother out there, Dr. Lucy Wilson, I didn't really have a conversation with her. I just overheard her conversation and, you know, was able to assume certain things based on that. And we didn't really have a conversation other than knowing that that wasn't right and she was going to straighten it out.
But how did you know that? Did you tell her that?
I must have told her, I must have told her and said, the school bus driver said that if they were bad, they had to sit with me. And she was like, what? And anybody knows my mom? day, she did not hold her tongue, and she used to be the chairman of the school board in Norfolk. So if you remember back in the 90s or 80s, that's my mom. So that's how my situation was handled. I wasn't talked to about it like this is how you handle it, or other than seeing my mom handle it. So I did get instruction on how to handle some things. But I want to talk about your situation with your toddler. With your son Jonathan, and I love the story in the book when you talk about the young man Eddie, who told your son Jonathan that he was black because he drank chocolate milk.
Yes. So the story goes, this is what really happened. So I have two sons, and my oldest son, when he was about 3, was in a preschool. And he came home and said, "Mom, Eddie says my skin is brown because I drink chocolate milk. Is that true?" In case you're wondering, it's not.
We've made progress.
And so that's what I said to him. So how do you talk to a 3-year-old about that? So I said, no, your skin is brown because you have something in your skin called melanin. Everybody has some. Even Eddie has some. But some people have more than others, and the more you have, the browner your skin is. And at your school, I said, you are the kid with the most. You thought that was pretty good?
Yeah, you are the winner.
But my question, I had 2 questions. So I'm like, okay, so we were living in a predominantly white community. My children grew up in Massachusetts, that's where we were, in a small college town in Massachusetts. And I thought to myself, well, obviously questions about difference are coming up in the preschool. How is the teacher handling it? And what about Eddie? Now let's talk about Eddie for a moment. Eddie was not trying to be mean or call names. He was a curious 3-year-old trying to figure out how come Jonathan's skin looks different from mine and the other kids. He was at that time, he was the only black kid in the class. And indeed, he had seen Jonathan drink chocolate. So it wasn't that, it was a completely far-fetched theory, that Eddie had. But clearly he was mistaken, and I wondered who's going to set Eddie straight. Right? I've had a perfectly fine conversation with my son, but who's going to set Eddie straight? So the next day, I went to school and I asked the teacher how she was talking to kids about difference in the classroom. And she said, well, it hasn't come up.
But it has.
Yes, so I told her about my conversation, and clearly it had come up in places where she perhaps had not heard it. Maybe that conversation was out on the sandbox, or in the pretend corner, or maybe out of the earshot of the teacher. But I also wondered whether this was a case of what I call in the book selective inattention. Meaning that, sometimes when your kid says something or does something that you don't really want to deal with, you kind of tune it out. If I didn't hear it, I don't have to respond to it, right? And so, of course, I talked with her about why I thought it was important to have these conversations, and there are certainly resources for preschool teachers and parents about how to talk to young children about difference in ways that are empowering for all kids. And for those of you who are wondering, well, what are those resources? There are a lot of them in my book, chapter 3. But the fact of the matter is, I don't know whether anybody set Eddie straight on that subject. But it speaks to, again, the silence that is there. Kids have questions, and it's perfectly appropriate to ask those questions, or for them to ask and for us to answer them. And we can talk even about painful things like slavery or racism, contemporary examples of racism, police shootings. There's a wonderful book that was just introduced to me this summer entitled Something Happened in Our Town, which is about a police shooting and how to talk to young children about that, written by a couple of psychologists. So this is to say there are resources, but these are conversations that we should engage, not to try to avoid.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we're talking about right now school and children, and of course all of us would prefer that, our children grow up colorblind and we live in this utopia and all of that. Well, that we don't have to deal with it at 3 years
Yes,
old,
yeah.
But just recently as today, CNN reported that a New York teacher allegedly forced Black students to participate in a mock slave auction for their social studies lesson. From a personal perspective, I can say that something similar happened to my daughter, in which she was used with other brown children to explain 3/5 of a person, which is how they used to count African Americans so that Southern states would have more seats in Congress. So at this point, when you see things happening and you see it, and it's covered nationwide, and is this intentional? Do people really not know that this is not cool? I mean, what do we need to do just for everybody? Can we get them all in one room and say, hey, don't do that. That's not a good idea. It's important to learn the lesson. It is important to understand the history and to get the background of, our country. You have to know that. But to select people, particularly children who are going through adolescence or their middle school where, it's so important to be cool or it's so important to be accepted.
Clearly a bad idea.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. I mean, pedagogically, for lots of reasons, bad idea. But the fact of the matter is, and we were talking a little bit about this backstage, so to speak, that when a story like that is in the news and, who knows what that teacher in all likelihood will be sanctioned in some way, and, and then you see another incident like it a week or two later, you wonder, well, didn't
they see it?
Did that teacher see it?
Yeah.
Wasn't she watching the news that night? Maybe not. But the fact of the matter is that what we are dealing with is not just an episodic incident here or there. What I think we are dealing with, which we have trouble as a nation acknowledging and struggling with, is a legacy of white supremacy, which is really baked into our society and bubbles up repeatedly, kind of like, oil bubbling up from the surface, in places where oil has been produced. There's a wonderful book, a very instructive book entitled Stamped from the Beginning, which talks about the idea of white supremacy and the ideology of that and how it has really been woven into the culture of American history and contemporary life in ways that, we see manifesting all the time. I know that here in Virginia, there's been that story about blackface, right? I'm just going to say that story about blackface. You can fill in the rest. But I'm using this as an example because when that story was breaking, there were many people not linked to the story who said, I didn't know that was offensive. And you would have to say, well, it's been offensive since the 18th century. And
where were you?
But I use that as an example because it has been offensive since, the 18th century, the 19th century, because it was used to make fun of people, right? It was used as a way of caricaturing African Americans. And if you don't know that history, you could say, well, I didn't know that. Well, how come you didn't know it? Well, because it wasn't taught in school. It wasn't talked about. It wasn't part of my cultural understanding. And yet, the idea of imitating and making fun of was part of the cultural understanding, right? And it was part of the cultural understanding because it's been part of the culture for so long. We like to think that we've moved beyond it, and many people have worked hard to move beyond it. And certainly today, we look out at this diverse audience sitting together in Virginia, that wouldn't have always happened, right? We know that that's a sign of progress. And yet, at the same time, there are some parts of our, there's some, I heard a quote today, actually, that wasn't about racism per se. The quote was, let's see if I can remember it, I heard it on the radio. Someone was being quoted as having said, Hitler and Stalin are not gone. They're just waiting for us to forget.
Exactly.
Did you get that?
Exactly.
Okay. Hitler and Stalin are not gone, they're just waiting for us to forget. And I think the same is true for the racism that's embedded in our society. It's not really gone, but it goes dormant, and it bubbles up when people start to forget, or think that they don't have to pay attention anymore.
Or get their attention span is short because there's a new news story that's no longer in the news.
Or there's different leadership. And I think it's important to say about leadership matters, right? So I was on a panel with another psychologist once who talked about the fact that it is part of our innate psychology to see difference, to categorize. And it's true. Our brains are programmed to categorize. We categorize everything. You know, we categorize cars, we categorize types of furniture, we categorize weather, we categorize people. We organize information by creating categories. So it is not surprising that when we meet someone who is different from us, we create a category, right? But it is also important to say that there's another characteristic of human beings, and that is we are social animals, not unlike wolves and other social animals. We travel in packs, and we follow the leader. And we look to the leader for guidance as to who is in our circle, who belongs to our pack, and who belongs outside of it. And the leader has the opportunity to draw the circle, who's inside the circle. The leader has the opportunity to draw the circle in a very broad way. All y'all are in my circle. Or in a very narrow way. Only these people are in my circle. Everybody else is a problem. And when we look at rhetoric locally or nationally, we can see that as the circles are being drawn, people follow that behavior. You know, so when someone says, we can be here, you cannot, there are lots of people who will follow that and say, just people like me can be here, those people shouldn't be here. We lead by example, and leadership matters. Human beings pay attention to what the leader does and often follow the example.
Okay.
And when I talk about leaders, I'm not just talking about national leaders. I'm talking about the leader of the family, the leader of the local church, the leader of the synagogue, the leader of the mosque, the leader of the community, the mayor, the classroom teacher, the bus driver is the leader in that moment. And so that person has a certain group authority to create insiders and outsiders.
Well, speaking of leaders, and the elephant in the room that you brought up earlier, I do want to ask what your perspective is of our governor and the blackface situation. Now, when this happened, it went away and it came back a few weeks ago. Don't get uncomfortable now, because this is what we do. We're talking about it. So I'm interested in knowing what your perspective is, because when he spoke about the incident, he talked about making change, going out in the community, making a difference, trying to understand people. And we heard a lot about the negative that, those pictures brought up. But we haven't heard, unless I'm not paying attention and somebody wants to raise their hand and inform me about it. But I haven't heard a lot about, there's a commission that's been set up by our governor to talk about race and to change things. I haven't heard about that. And you were contacted by the Washington Post to suggest some items that he could read.
Yes. So when the news was hot, right? When that, the first round of news, when the story first broke, there was a lot of discussion about what should be done, and the governor talked about his own soul searching and the desire for dialogue. And the Washington Post reached out to me and others to say, you know, the governor says he wants to educate himself, what should he be reading? And so, and they, you know, you can find the article, they talked to a number of people and I made a couple of suggestions, one of which was that book Stamped from the Beginning, in addition to mine, of course. And he and other people made suggestions, and the Washington Post published the article. And then, as you said, I haven't heard, and I did hear the recent report that came out from the medical school, you know, saying basically they can't.
So what should be done? I mean, how do we,
So
since
my
we're
question
leaders,
is-
and you're talking
Yeah.
about being a leader in the pack,
Yeah.
what advice would you give our governor?
So I would give the governor the advice to do what he said he was going to do, which perhaps he's doing, I don't know, I don't live in Virginia. But I would say it's an opportunity to engage the wider community in conversation. You know, he has learned some things. I don't know what he's been reading, but he is in a position as a leader to launch dialogue and conversation in a way, and as I understand it, you know, he's term limited, and so doesn't have the anxiety perhaps of someone running for re-election, even though that shouldn't be an excuse. And so I think there's an opportunity to use that platform to say we have history that we should better understand. You know, I was a college president for 13 years, and I now spend some time working with other campuses and talking to faculty, and I was just this afternoon reading a report that was prepared, and it's a public document, so I don't mind saying, reading a report that was prepared at Furman University, which is located in South Carolina. And Furman University is one of several universities across the nation that is studying the impact of slavery. You know, their history to slavery. And at Furman is named after a man who owned slaves and was an advocate for preserving slavery. He was a secessionist. He was in it, right? You know, deep in it. And so I mentioned that to say that the university has been looking at, given this history, what should we be doing now to address the historical harms that have impacted our community, and what should we be doing now going forward to acknowledge the complexity of that history. You know, there were unpaid workers, also known as slaves, who built that institution. How should their contributions be recognized by the institution? What should we be doing that acknowledges the wealth that was created and has built this institution? And of course, Furman is just one of many. Georgetown, you know, was in the news, and others. And so I'm sure there are institutions in Virginia that would have those histories. And so the question is not to pretend that history doesn't exist, but how do we understand that history and how it informs the present, and what we can then do to move forward together in the future. Those are tough conversations, but they're important conversations, and I think we're at a moment when we need to be having them.
Yes, and I attended one of those universities, the University of Virginia. Okay, so I want to take a move a little bit, and I want to talk about a viral video. I don't know if anybody saw it over the last few days, and it's a young lady who just graduated from high school, and she's wearing her cap and gown, and she's walking down the street, and she's meeting her father, who had been deported when she was 4 years old, and giving him a hug because she graduated and he was not able to be at her graduation. A lot of people have seen the video. It's got millions of views. And so I want to take a turn to talk about immigration and deportation.
Sure.
And how those are laced in our racial conversation.
Well, I think, you know, again, I think that if we want to understand the context of the immigration conversation that's happening in our nation right now, we have to look at some history. And here's a historical moment. I want us to go back to 1954. And you might say, why 1954? Because it's the year I was born. Brown versus and also the Brown versus Board of Education. But in 1954, the U.S. population was 90% white.
Right.
90% white, 10% everybody else. Fast forward to today, 2018, if we're talking about the U.S. population under the age of 21, basically that elementary, secondary, this generation right now, the 0 to 18. If we're looking at that population is about 50% kids of color, about 50% white. That's a big change. And that change has happened pretty rapidly. And most of that change has happened as a result of immigration. Some of it differential birth rates, but mostly it's about immigration, and it's about immigration from non-European countries. Now, when we talk about that, what's important to say, and I actually didn't know this fact until I was working on the updated version of my book, but if up until the mid-50s, I want to say 56 was the year, but I might, sometime around then, you could not be a citizen of the United States. If you were born here, you could be a citizen. But if you immigrated here, it didn't matter how long you'd been here. If you were not white, you could not be a citizen. Not most people knew that. You could not be a citizen. So there were cases, legal cases, of people who had come and had been working, and typically the legal case that I'm thinking of involved a man from India, an Indian man who had been in the United States for a long time. He'd come here and started working and formed a business and wanted to become a citizen, and he was not allowed to become a citizen because he was not Caucasian. And he sued to say, I am Caucasian. Now, if you know where the word Caucasian comes from, it's the Caucasus Mountains, and that touches part of India, and if you got the geography. So he was making the case that, I'm from the part of the world where Caucasians live, right? And the judge said, I know a white man when I see one. And you are not white. That was the decision. And for that reason, he was not allowed to become a citizen. That was the law of the land until it changed in the late 1950s. Okay, fast forward. Now, again, as I said, so for example, if you had immigrated here as a Japanese person, you couldn't become a citizen because you weren't white. If your children were, your child's born in the United States, your child is a citizen, but you're never a citizen, right? Now, fast forward, the law changed in the 50s, that changed, but there was very limited immigration from non-European countries until 1965. At the same time that the Voting Rights Act was being passed, there was a law being passed that opened the immigration to non-European countries. And we saw what was a rapid increase in the number of people coming from Asia, from Africa, from Central and South America. And it is largely because of that immigration flow that the population has shifted the way it has in America. So you might say, well, so what's the big deal? Well, from my point of view, there is no big deal. But if you are one of those people who used to be 90% and is now 50% and is concerned that maybe soon it'll be 40% or 30%, then you want to say, hold it. There are too many people coming from those places. Or as President Trump once said, why don't we get people from Norway? Well, I want to tell you something about Norway, if I might. Sure. I visited Norway on vacation last summer, not this past summer, 2 summers ago. And I had a really interesting experience sitting on the train talking with a young Norwegian man who happened to be Asian, actually. His family had immigrated to Norway from Vietnam. And he told me about the free college that free college education And he told me about the universal health care, and he told me about the, strong economy. And
So who wants to leave Norway?
Exactly. Exactly. So my point simply is, I think we need to understand the racial dimension of this immigration conversation.
You quoted in your book Stephen Brown's book, which is Brown is the New White.
Yeah.
And he said that every single day, 8,000 people are born in the U.S. and 90% are people of color.
Yes.
So is the immigration and...
Well, not born. What he said was, every day the population increases by 8,000.
Okay.
But it's increasing not just by birth, it's increasing by immigration.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I stand corrected.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you think that the immigration and deportation discussion is an issue of race or power, or both?
Well, I think it's both. Because, so let's understand, racism is about power, right? So when we think about the concept of race, let's just talk about the concept of race. We know biologically, today we know biologically, there's a lot of pseudoscience that, we learned about. When I was growing up, we learned about, Caucasians and Asians and Negroes and Mongoloids. That was the language of anthropology. But the Genome Project has taught us that everyone is basically the same gene pool, right? That there's more similarity. I could be sitting here with a blonde, blue-eyed person, and we could be more genetically similar than you and I are, right? That the things that make us look different are such a small percentage of our overall genetic makeup that it accounts for very little of the variation, right? So this is to say, we know biologically there's only one race, and that's the human race, right? Having said that, race is a real social construct, meaning, we have assigned meaning to certain physical appearance, and we, all of us collectively, act on the assumptions that are embedded in those categories, going back to the categorization. But if we understand the origin of the concept, when did people start talking about racial difference? They started talking about racial difference when they wanted to enslave people. People think that racial difference came first and then people were enslaved. Actually, people were enslaved and then racial difference was used as a justification for why it ought to be okay. That's the order of the ideas. And so the idea of racial stratification is intimately linked to issues of power and advantage. So you can't really separate them.
Right. In your book, you had a chapter on white identity.
Yes.
And I found it kind of interesting because it began with a quote that said, "I'm not ethnic, I'm just normal."
Yeah.
And this was a quote from your book of how a white woman, Caucasian woman, described herself. So I'm interested in you expounding on that for our audience that didn't get a chance to read that chapter.
Sure. So that particular example, that particular quote comes from one of my students. When I was teaching at Mount Holyoke College, which is a women's college in Western Massachusetts, I taught there for 13 years, and while I was teaching, I taught a course for many years called Psychology of Racism, and much of what's in my book is informed by things I learned while I was teaching that course. And one of the things I used to do at the beginning of every semester was to ask students who were sitting in a circle, about 30 of them in a room, to introduce themselves to each other. And I asked them, each of them, to describe themselves in terms of their own racial and ethnic background. So we're going around the room, and there were other questions they were supposed to answer, like, and what difference has that made in terms of your experience, and, as a way of getting into the subject and getting to know each other. And so I had a young woman in my class who, when it was her turn to speak, didn't quite know how to describe herself. And in the end, she said, I'm just normal. And so
And what did you say?
So when I asked her, what did she mean by that? And she said, well, I'm just like everybody else. And I grew up in a very homogeneous community. I was just like everybody else, just normal. And as I probed with her, what I helped her understand and see is that I understood what she meant. I knew what she meant, meaning like, I didn't stand out. She was a white woman and she grew up in a white community, and most of her, was a largely white community. And so she was just like everyone else, and she didn't really identify with a particular ethnic origin, like, she might have said, I'm Italian or something like that. She didn't identify with a particular ancestral origin of that kind. But so she didn't know what to say, just normal. She could have said, I'm a white European American. She didn't say that. And so, but what I pointed out to her is that if you're describing yourself as just normal, what does that make the person sitting next to you who does not look like you? Is that person then just abnormal? Clearly that's not what she meant to imply.
Right.
But we can understand how language others people, defines who's in and who's out. If I'm just normal, I'm in. And people who are not just normal like me are out. And so, we all use language in ways that sometimes offend without intending to offend, because we haven't really thought about it. But there's something else about her experience that I think is worth saying. Because when we think about the diversity of the United States, it's becoming more and more diverse, but it's not evenly distributed. That diversity is not evenly distributed. And it is still the case today that many neighborhoods are highly segregated. And schools, as a result, are highly segregated because we rely on neighborhood schooling for the most part. And in a recent survey, which I cite in the book, about social networks, it was found that 75% of white adults have entirely white social networks, meaning they don't know any people of color, right? So if you live in a place where your neighborhood is all white and you belong to a school, or your kids go to a school that's all white, and you go to a church that's all white or mostly white, and you're working in a workplace where even if there are people of color, they don't work in your department. And so you really don't have anyone in your circle of friends and acquaintances who is different from you. If that's your life experience, it's not hard to see why you might say, I'm just normal, right? Even though that is clearly a problematic way of thinking about the world.
Well, we want to open up the questions to you all, since I have a bunch of questions.
Anniversary edition of your book. Was there anything you didn't feel you touched on in this edition?
Well, I'm sure. It's a book. It's not an encyclopedia. But in that sense, I'm sure there are things that I could have talked about. But I really tried to reflect on the items or the ways in which our society has changed over the last 20 years. And so the things I focused on were the population change, the political changes. Sometimes I call them 4 Ps. There are 4 Ps that mark how this book is different from the 1997 version. And I know there are people in the room who've probably read the 1997 version. But one of those changes is population. So our population is more diverse, and so there's more information in the new version about identity development, not just for Black youth, not just for white youth, but for Asian Americans, for Latinx, for Native Americans, Middle Eastern populations. The populations changed. The politics have changed, and the prologue talks a lot. We've talked here about some of the ways the political climate has changed. Polarization has changed. We are more polarized, I think we can agree, right at this moment than we have been at earlier periods, 20 years ago, let's say. And ultimately, what might we try to do about that? But the 4th P is psychology. And there are some things that we talk about today that psychologists were not writing about 20 years ago. I'm going to give you an example. Implicit bias. The research on implicit bias was really being published in the early 2000s. So that's in the last 20 years. Stereotype threat. That's a concept that educators will be familiar with. If you're wondering what is that, stereotype threat is a kind of performance anxiety that people experience when they're worried that they might confirm a stereotype. So if I'm a student in a class, if I'm an African American student taking, let's say, physics, and I'm one of a handful, maybe I'm the only African American student in my physics class, unless I'm at Spelman. But let's say I'm at a majority white university, I'm the only black student in the physics class, and I'm worried that people will have a stereotype about my ability to perform in a hard science. And I'm confused. And I want to ask a question of my professor. But if I ask the question, I might confirm the stereotype because I'll reveal my confusion. So then I don't ask the question. But if I don't ask the question, I don't get my confusion cleared up, and then I perform poorly because I didn't get the answer to my question. So it becomes kind of self-perpetuating, but you can see how stereotype threat inhibits performance. But that's a concept now highly regarded in social psychology, but that paper about stereotype threat was just being published in the late 90s. So there's a lot of psychology that we think about today that wasn't being written about yet, and microaggressions, that's another one. The research about the harmfulness of microaggressions is, again, largely a 21st century phenomenon.
Can you explain that for people?
Sure. So a microaggression is like a minor, so-called minor, small offense. I'm going to use that word. A small offense that would seem relatively harmless, but it's like death by 1,000 cuts. You know, if it happens a lot to you, I'm going to tell you a story I just heard recently of an Asian American woman, a college president, who she and I were in a meeting together, and she told me that she was walking through LaGuardia Airport and someone said to her, she, born in the United States, U.S. citizen, lived here all her life, someone yelled at her, "Why don't you go back where you came from?" And she said that had not happened to her for like 30 years. I mean, it had been a really long time, but it just happened, and we could call that a microaggression. You might say it's a macroaggression. Right. But she wasn't physically injured, she wasn't, assaulted. Maybe something less dramatic. And certainly we could talk about the incident in the school you described, That, I think, is also a macroaggression.
Yeah.
But, microaggression might be, this is a true story, a professor handing back a paper to a student. The student happened to be one of my advisees, and she told me about something that happened in one of her classes. White professor handing back a paper to the black female student, and he says to her when he gives the paper back, "Congratulations, she got an A on this assignment." And then he says, "Black students don't usually do well in my class." This was very demotivating for her, very demotivating, upsetting to her. She was quite upset about it. He didn't intend to offend her. He was trying to say something nice, right? And so, but that's an example of a microaggression. And if things like that happen to you all the time, frequently, it helps explain why so many black people are walking around with high blood pressure, as just one example.
That and diet. We have a lunch for that.
Yes.
Okay, we have another question.
Dr. Tatum, an audience member asks, if you are not in a top leadership position in your school district, how do you begin to address a need for cultural competency professional development with staff and teachers?
That's a great question. So of course, leadership matters in the sense that, leaders get to decide certain things, but everyone exercises leadership in some way. We all influence other people. So let's imagine I'm a teacher in a school with no status. I'm not a curriculum leader, I'm not a department head, I'm not anything. And in that kind of structural role of authority. even someone in that position, and for a long time I was someone in that kind of a position. When I was a junior faculty member, not yet tenured, teaching in a college, you still can influence other people. You can say, I am on Twitter as you are, and I see sometimes teachers posting their summer reading. Just recently, I've been seeing people, I saw someone posting, I'm reading these 3 books over the summer because I want to better understand my students when we come back to school. That teacher's post included, one of the books included was mine, which is why I saw it, because she put my Twitter handle in her message. But I was delighted to see my book as one of the 3. But here's the thing, other people retweeted it. Other teachers started saying to her, thank you for showing me your list. That looks like a great list. I'm going to read those books too. I'm using that as an example to say, we don't know anything about that person's authority position in the school, but she's influencing other people. And let's imagine that teacher is in the building and school's not out yet and said to her colleagues, I've been hearing about this great book. Or I've read it and it's really helping me, but maybe I'm hearing about it. I want to read it over the summer. Will you be in a book club with me? That's kind of grassroots professional development. Now, how much better it would be if the principal said, I'm buying this book for everyone in the school. We're all going to read it together, or the superintendent, right? But I use that example to say each of us can influence other people, sometimes even if it's just a small circle of people, and through that, those efforts can ignite change.
You have another question?
Yes. Why is it assumed that every white person, because they are white, has white privilege? It seems it's a long question.
That's part of my
It seems to me that it is somewhat, or can be discriminatory on its own.
Okay.
Keep going. Does the assumption propagate racism on all sides? Do you really consider everybody who is white privileged? Can't we say that about any race, Black, Latino, Islamic, etc.?
No, we cannot. That's enough. Thanks. And I want to answer the question in a very sincere way, which is to say that if you understand racism as a system of advantage, you would not ask the question. So we have to start with that, right? We have to start with understanding racism as a system of advantage. If you understand that, now to say that every white person has white privilege is not to say every white person has had an easy life, right? That's not what it means. It means, however, that there are certain advantages that come with being white that every white person has. And you might say, like what? Like having the opportunity to see people who look like you in your kid's classroom textbook, as an example. Which Black people can't say, Muslims can't say, Native Americans can't say, There's a benefit of the doubt that comes with being white that has nothing to do with whether you deserve it or not, right? And let's use an example. Let's use police stoppings, right? If you are stopped by the police and you are a white person, you probably are not worried that he might shoot you. That's a privilege, folks. And you might say, well, I have been stopped by the police, and the police officer's been rude, and all of those things. But the likelihood is the first thought you have is not, is he going to shoot you?
That's it.
Right?
That's it.
Or if your kid is out late at night, you're not worrying, has he been shot by a police officer? Right? That's not what you might be thinking. got drunk, ran off the road, something terrible has happened, but that's probably not one of the items on your list. So I think that it's important to say, now I just want to say, and there's so many examples that of part of the challenge here is that when you have privilege, you don't notice it. That's part of the problem. Now, I'm going to speak about myself as, so I identify as African American and I'm a woman, but I have some other identities. One of my identities is that I'm able-bodied. Now, when I walked in here, I didn't look at the stage and think to myself, how am I getting up on that stage? I didn't think about it because I don't have trouble with stairs, it's not a problem. But if I had come in the room in a wheelchair, I'd be worried about this stage, right? And that's a privilege that I didn't have to think about it. That's an able-bodied person's privilege. I wasn't thinking about it, but I can't deny that I have it. I'm a heterosexual. I'm married to a man and have been married to him for 40 years, and I work places where I've always had a picture of my family on my desk. And I have never had to worry what is going to happen if someone sees this picture of my family. That's a privilege, folks. But just because I'm not thinking about it doesn't mean I don't have it. And so when we talk about white privilege, we're not saying that, everything is easy in a white person's life. It means that there are some things that happen for white people that they don't have to think about, that other people are thinking about. It's as simple as that. And so, it's not an insult to tell somebody they have privilege. It's just a statement of fact. And if you don't understand what privileges you have, spend some time with someone who doesn't have them. Hang out with, and you will see what they are. When I was teaching, I used to ask my students to do this. I used to ask them to spend a day observing the ways in which my white students, I would ask my white students to spend a day observing how you move through the world and how other people are moving through the world. And they'd come back and would have noticed quite a few things. They would, remember when people used to write checks in the grocery store? We don't do that anymore. But when we used to write checks, some people get asked for ID and some people don't. Some use a debit card and you get asked for an ID. I'm in the grocery store and I watch white people eating the food. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, and I'm like, never in my life have I opened the bag and started to eat it before I paid for it. But I see that happen all the time. I see people picking the grapes and eating the grapes. I mean, maybe you want to taste the grapes, but I don't do that. Why don't you do it? I don't do that because I know that black people will get in trouble for doing it. You're stealing. Yes, exactly. So here's the thing. Just because you haven't noticed it doesn't mean you don't have it. And if you are confused by that, I'm going to invite you to read my book and also spend time with people whose racial category is different than your own and observe what happens to them in the world.
We have a question? Yes. Dr. Tatum, this question comes from a middle school student. She asks, I want to know the best way to confront racism amongst my peers. My white counterparts keep requesting passes to use the N-word from African American students, and I find this offensive. When I speak up, they laugh and become increasingly disrespectful. How should I handle this situation?
So this is a great question, and unfortunately it's a common question. And so I have a couple of things to say. One is that when we talk about cross-racial friendships, one of the things that we have to say is that there's rules for those friendships, right? And if you tell your friends that a word is offensive and they still want to use it, then they're not really your friends, right? Now the other part of this is you might not even be trying to be friends, but you're classmates, and it's distressful. It's a microaggression to have to be dealing with this in the classroom. So then the question is, where are the adults in the environment? Where's the teacher? You know, where's the assistant principal? You know, where are the people who are supposed to be helping young people develop cultural competence so that they can engage effectively in the 21st century? That for students to be asking that question of each other and not be getting guidance from adults suggests that the adults are not doing their job. So to the young person who's in that situation, I would say, seek out friends who understand your experience, and 2, talk to adults about why it's important for them to step up, and engage your parents perhaps in helping you with that. We got another one back.
So, last question.
Time flies.
So this is from James Rogers in our audience tonight. We have these conversations periodically, and we talk and talk and talk. What is the call to action for whites and blacks?
Okay, so my call to action is stop having episodic conversations. So what do I mean by that? So, you know, the director of the Community Foundation stood up and said that this was the first one. There are a lot of you here. I hope that you will come to some other ones. And maybe those other ones won't be hundreds of people, but maybe a dozen people. Maybe it's small groups in your community where you commit to having dialogue, multiracial, multi-ethnic dialogue, and it's not just one evening, but maybe it's 8 evenings, maybe it's 12 evenings. The reason I say that is because in order to get beyond the superficial, in order to go deeper, you have to invest time. Because here's what happens. You have a conversation and you might say, so some of you are sitting here thinking, I have learned some things, I've enjoyed this conversation. Some of you may be thinking, I'm offended by something she said, you know, I'm not coming to any more of these. You know, some of you, there's a range of responses. But let's imagine you had all signed up to come back again next week and talk to each other. If you are offended, you have to go home and think about what offended you, and next week come back and tell somebody. And you know, maybe you didn't like what I said about privilege, and so then you're going to have a conversation about that. And someone who really can say from their life experience living in this area, here's some of the ways I know I don't have privilege. Here's what happens to me and my kids in school. You know, let me tell you about my experience. And that other person is going to listen, and maybe is still going to feel uncomfortable, but you know what, has agreed to come back next week. And then is going to share, you know, here's why it doesn't feel good to me, and here's how even though I'm white, I've suffered in my context, whatever that is. There's going to be an exchange of stories, and that exchange of stories is going to, over time, lead to trust. And when you get to trust, then you can take action, and you can take collective action. And this is a model that's being used all around the country, where people commit to having dialogue with each other over a period of time, even when it doesn't feel good, coming back again, because it's only when you get past that point of, that what I call the arc of discomfort, it's only when you get past the arc of discomfort that you really start to feel like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. But most of the time what happens is people show up for 1 or 2, don't like it, go home, don't come back. And never get to the place where it actually is energizing. I want to say something about energy, and then I'll stop talking, okay? And that is to say, we use a lot of energy not talking, right? Let's imagine there's You said the elephant in the room. Let's imagine there really was an elephant, I mean a real elephant, in the room, standing right in that aisle, doing whatever elephants do. And I've asked you to pretend you don't see that elephant. Work hard to ignore that elephant. Do whatever you have to do. Close your eyes, sing a song, put on your earphones, do whatever you can to ignore that elephant, even if it looks like it's coming towards you. That takes a lot of psychological energy. And then if after a while you've been trying to repress that elephant, I said, you know what, now let's acknowledge there's an elephant, and maybe we can even, move out of the elephant's way, and, you'd be like, thank God. The fact of the matter is, when we spend energy pretending not to notice, not talking about it, acting like everyone's being treated the same, not paying attention to the news. How is it that that teacher didn't know the story about the person in New York? Because she's not paying attention, or she's tuning it out. And that takes up psychological energy. When we allow ourselves to notice and start to work on it, it's actually quite energizing. I have spent a lot of my life doing professional development with teachers, and one of the things they tell me repeatedly, this was really energizing. Why is it energizing? Because you're using a lot of energy not talking about it. When you give people permission to engage the conversation in an authentic way, it actually gets to be fun. And then, it's not just about talking, folks, it's about talking so you can be mobilizing to take productive action. But that requires collective action. And there is a special responsibility, I think it's important to say, for white people to own some of that conversation. For all the reasons we talked about. There's a system of advantage based on race, and if you are in the advantaged group, it requires more responsibility to take action.
Well, wow. Such a wonderful time. I still have more questions, but we can't go on. I want to thank the Hampton Roads Community Foundation and Virginia Humanities, and also Dr. Beverly Tatum. Thank you all so much.
Wow, that was really awesome. That was amazing. Thank you, Dr. Tatum. Great words for thought. Thank you, April Woodard, for your questions and your engagement. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. So I have my copy of my book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. You can get your copy tonight as well in the lobby. And Dr. Tatum will be signing books as well. And Dr. Tatum mentioned tonight about small conversations and continue the conversation moving forward from tonight. So we have you on our list. You signed up for this event, and we will continue those conversations in the fall, and you will learn more about that. So thanks again for coming out tonight, and everyone have a wonderful evening.